Why do you say current academic literature and media still contributes to the negative view African and people of African descent have about themselves?
Right, of course, it's very effective. And one way that I like explaining it is to refer people to a short speech that's available on YouTube called "You Can't Hate the Roots of a Tree Without Hating the Tree" by Malcolm X. It's no more than 5 minutes, but it really captures it better than anyone that I've heard, better than I'm able to communicate it as well. And it makes sense. He said when Africa was controlled by the European colonial powers, they projected the image of Africa negatively. Jungle, savages, cannibals, backward, and it had a number of impacts. It turned off Africans in the diaspora, including African Americans, from being attracted to the African continent. And as he put it, it instilled self-hatred as well without even realizing. He said, you can't hate your origins without hating yourself. You can't hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree, which is Africa. And he gave examples. He said, we have people that hate the shape of their nose, hate the shape and size of their lips, hate the type of texture of their hair. Said, they hate every part of themselves and they internalize that. And it's just impossible. You cannot hate your origin without unconsciously hating yourself. And the same applies to Africans in diaspora, also applies to Africans on the continent, because many of them also feed and read the literature that is produced in the West. Even if the literature is produced in African countries, most of the literature emulates the literature of the West. You have Africans that have always challenged that, like Chinua Achebe, the famous Nigerian author. Many people know him by his book, Things Fall Apart. Wole Soyinka, the Nobel Prize winner, although I believe Chinua deserved the Nobel as well. But by the way, these are all Western symbols and prizes anyway. But if you're going to give it to Soyinka, Achebe deserves it too. And another one who also deserves the Nobel is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He's a Kenyan. And what I like about him that he writes plays, he writes fiction, novels as well, but he writes essays. In fact, my favorite type of his writing are the essays, in which he criticizes Africans for abandoning their culture, abandoning their heritage, abandoning their history. In other words, he's saying the same thing that Malcolm was saying in a different language. That, when you start aping the West, you start emulating the West, that becomes your standard and your measure of development, of achievement. When ironically, as you know, living in the polluted industrial societies where life is so mechanical, you have a movement of Europeans wanting to go to Africa or the Caribbean, So they know what is actually essential and of quality, but at the same time they demonize so that Africans in Africa don't even know the value of what they have. They don't know how good they have it. So that has been the most effective legacy of colonialism. The Europeans don't need to have European soldiers in Africa anymore. They have Africans that have been conditioned over generations to hate themselves and police themselves. So when you have Africans wanting to emulate Europe and be like Europe, Europe feels no threat at all. And that is the dilemma. And that is why it's important for us to challenge the narrative. I hated that narrative even as a young person when I was 12 years old. I'm born in Uganda, but my family lived in Tanzania. And in Tanzania is really when I started gaining my consciousness. When I was 12, I started reading a lot of publications, books. And I noticed in Western media in particular, including United States media, that was disseminated there, the representation of Africans and African descendants was always as inferior. And I started writing letters to the editor. Throughout my life, I was doing that. But then at some point as an adult, you know, friends told me, why are you shouting from outside the walls? Why don't you become actively involved? So I went back to graduate school. I studied journalism at Columbia, and I wrote my master's thesis on the historical demonization of Africa. And eventually, over the years, I continued the research. 2 years ago, in 2021, I published the book Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media.